Great. Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest monthly talk in the St. Luke's on the Lake Positive Parenting Series. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kasha Cristobal, a member of St. Luke's, and it's my pleasure today to welcome pediatric feeding specialist Amy Martin. My son Francisco has been working with her this past year, and we're really excited that she can join us today. So Amy Martin is a pediatric occupational therapist for Kite Strings Pediatric Therapy, which is now in Spicewood, so near Lakeway. She grew up in Austin, received her Bachelor of Science degree in kinesiology from the University of Texas at Austin, and then attended Texas Women University in Houston, where she received her Master's of Occupational Therapy and is a occupational therapist register, which I learned is what OTR stands for.
Yes.
A little alphabet soup here thrown in. So Amy has been practicing since 2008 and has treated children in a variety of settings, including outpatient acute care, pediatric intensive care, neonatal intensive care, and the home environment. And she first started practicing at Dell Children's Medical Center. She currently specializes in the assessment and treatment of feeding and swallowing disorders, which is where Francisco fits in. And as a pediatric feeding specialist, Amy helps support infants, toddlers, children and their families with feeding, with the goal of meal times being more enjoyable for everyone. So just a reminder before I turn this over to Amy that today's talk is recorded and will be available on YouTube via St. Luke's Facebook parenting page, if you want to refer back to it later or share with others. And then today's session is roughly 45 minutes. So we'll have our speaker and then 15 minutes at the end roughly for questions. So feel free to ask questions throughout or use the chat feature if you'd like. And then sometimes things do run over, but we have a hard stop at 11:30 for the church's next Zoom session. So without further ado, please welcome Amy Martin. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. And I'm so honored that you guys asked me to talk today. So thank you for having me. So we'll just go ahead and get started. I wanted to talk today a little bit more about picky and hesitant eating. So really quick, and you just talked a little bit about myself, which is wonderful. Thank you so much. A little bit more about myself is I have 3 kiddos. I have 2 girls, ages 9, 7, and then a little boy who's 2. And as you said, I have been practicing as a licensed occupational therapist for a little over 13 years. And for a majority of that time, I have been mostly specializing in feeding therapy. And so I help babies, toddlers, children through adolescence with feeding challenges. And this definitely includes picky and hesitant eating. And I also help babies with bottle feeding and helping babies transition to solid foods or table foods who might be having a harder time with that transition. And I love what I do. It's so much fun. So my passion with my work is helping families create more peaceful and more enjoyable meal times. You know, a lot of the families that I work with come to me, there's a lot of stress around meal times. And so I just love helping families find more peace and enjoyment around meal times. I too have a picky eater in my household. And so that's been a challenge, but it's also, I think, helped me to relate to the families that I work with. And I feel like I'm able to show up for the families as a pediatric feeding specialist, but also a mom. So I currently work at Kite Strings Pediatric Therapy in private practice. And because of this last year with the pandemic, I have been doing a lot of teletherapy. I also do one-on-one feeding therapy in our clinic. And Kite Strings has a wonderful team of pediatric occupational therapists, feeding therapists, myself, speech therapists, and I said OT, I meant to say OT, PTs, and speech therapists. So, all right. So there is quite a range within picky eating. Some of the families that I work with, the families will come to me and they're starting to get a little bit concerned about their children's nutrition, and they are just really wanting their child to eat more of a variety of foods. And then there's that range. And then I have some families on the other end of the spectrum where their child is eating maybe a handful of foods or less. Their child is requiring nutritional supplementation. Nutrition is becoming a concern, and there's some big meltdowns around meal times, refusals, anxiety and worry around meal times. And that anxiety and worry around meal times can be for the child and absolutely for the parents also. And so when I'm working with families, I see those ranges, and there's a lot in between. And so what does picky eating look like? So again, there's a big range, but for the most part, what I see is children not eating from one or more complete food groups. Usually what I see is a child is refusing all meats or proteins, or all fruits, or all vegetables. Those are common food groups that a child might be refusing to eat. Picky eating can also look like meltdowns if new or non-preferred foods are put in front of them. A lot of times these kiddos will even refuse to come to the mealtime table because it's so stressful. Many times the children who are picky eaters will only feel comfortable with eating their same preferred foods over and over. There's a lot of worry around meal times for the parent and the child. Parents often tell me that they feel like they're a short order cook, that they might make one meal for their picky or hesitant eater, and then another meal for the rest of the family. And we as parents do this because we're starting to get worried about nutrition, and we want our children to eat, and we know they'll eat this certain food, so that's what we make them. And picky eating can also look like a limited food range, but then over time, the food range can get smaller and smaller and smaller. Nutrition can start to become a concern for parents and or the pediatrician. And then also a lot of times kiddos will be very rigid about food. Only eat a specific brand of strawberry yogurt or a specific brand of chicken nuggets. And they kind of have rules about what and how foods are served. So some kiddos, might like a grilled cheese sandwich, but if we cut that grilled cheese sandwich into triangles, that might completely throw them off. So they have some rigidity around meal times. And so on to what are some things that can lead to picky eating. And there's kind of several pieces of this puzzle, and children might have one piece that could contribute to picky eating, or they might have all of the pieces that can contribute to picky eating. And so we're going to talk right after the slide in more detail, but just really quick. Things that can lead to picky eating is a routine and structure at home that might not be optimal to addressing picky eating. Sensory processing challenges, that's a big one. Motor skill challenges can contribute to hesitant or picky eating. And then this is also a big one, just worry and anxiousness, or children preferring things to be the same. They don't like change. Temperament can be a piece to this puzzle. Medical conditions, and then something called learned avoidance reactions, which we'll talk more about. So when can a feeding evaluation be helpful? One thing I kind of wanted to say first is there can be a typical period of picky eating, and this usually happens between the ages of 18 months to 3 years of age. And actually 1 out of 4 typical developing children may not grow out of picky eating. And we'll talk more about that in just a bit. But a feeding evaluation might be helpful if meal times are becoming stressful most of the time, okay? Another topic that might warrant a feeding evaluation is if your child gags frequently or has had a choking episode. If a child strongly refuses 1 or more food groups, and then if your child is pretty rigid about food, so a little bit about what we just talked about, if they'll only eat specific brands, they'll only eat, maybe with the screen time on, And they've kind of created some specific rules on what, when, and how food is served. And just a little side note, the information from that slide was taken from Melanie Poddick. She, her website has wonderful feeding resources. Okay, so one of the first things that I kind of wanted to talk about with things that can create picky eating is routine and structure within the family or at home that may not be optimal for addressing picky eating. And so there are things that we as parents can do at home that may cause picky eating to get worse over time. And, you know, everything that I'm about to mention, I feel like most parents do these things, including myself. But these things can kind of lead to this cycle towards picky or hesitant eating. So one of the first things that we as parents can do is pressuring our kids to eat at meal times. You know, a lot of times we'll say things like, you know, take a bite, or you need to eat your broccoli first and then you can have dessert, or if you eat your chicken nuggets, you'll grow big and strong. And again, we as parents, and I say we as parents because I'm in this too as a mama, we mean these with the best intentions, and we're saying these things because we might be kind of worried about their nutrition, or we're worried that they're not eating vegetables. So we are trying to kind of have a little bit more control in this. So pressuring our child to eat at meal times. Some other things that we might do at home is serving the same preferred foods over and over. That only makes sense because we want our children to eat, right? Sometimes we as parents may not be exposing or offering sometimes we as parents might not be offering and exposing our children to new foods. We might be short order cooking at home. A lot of times families will cook a meal and then their child will say, I don't want that. And then they'll allow their child to go to the kitchen to get whatever they want to eat. A lot of times, and I do this too, when we go out to eat, and I know that's been different during a pandemic, but you know, when we're eating out, it's just kind of within our culture that we just give our kids the kids menu, which is great sometimes, but there's actually so many options, you know, within the whole menu that they could be exposed to and learning about with the new foods. Another thing that parents do a lot is kind of allowing their kiddos to eat anywhere in the home. And this can be completely okay on some occasions, but more often than not, families that are coming to see me, their child will only eat on the couch in front of the TV or in other places around the house. And then, you know, sometimes families are not able to eat together as a family often just because of schedules. But that is something that we'll talk about in a minute that can be helpful. And then another bullet point that can sometimes lead towards this picky eating cycle is allowing our kids to graze throughout the day, because then that impacts appetite and they just may not be as hungry when we do offer our more nutritious foods. So another piece of the puzzle, or another point that can cause picky eating is sensory processing challenges. So there's two types of, well, there's a few more types of sensory processing challenges, but today I'm just going to talk about sensory over registration and sensory under registration. So right here with sensory over registration, some kids will experience sensory input with a heightened experience that makes them incredibly uncomfortable. So they may experience input from foods, the way a food looks, smells, tastes, feels on their hands, or feels in their mouth, and they can experience that sensory input to a heightened degree. So sensory over registration can feel incredibly uncomfortable for kids, and it can even make them feel repulsed with looking at a new food or tasting a new food or feeling a new food. And then of course, I just gotta sign on my computer that says my internet is unstable. Can y'all still see and hear me? Are we good? Okay, we're good. Sorry. Okay, so yeah, if a child is over registering sensory input from their senses, of course they're going to put up their walls and maybe start new and different foods, be comfortable. So actually that is a very common piece that I see when I'm working with kiddos who are maybe experiencing picky or hesitant eating. Another piece is sensory under registration. So kiddos in this group might experience sensory input from their senses to a lesser degree, excuse me. So they may not feel foods as well in their mouth. And because of this, chewing and manipulating food inside of their mouth can be very difficult for them. Some red flags for sensory under registration. Sometimes these kiddos will overly stuff their mouth, because the more food that's in their mouth, the better they're able to feel the food in their mouth. A lot of times these kiddos will pocket food in their mouth, and it is literally pocket kind of inside their cheek, and they may have no idea it's there, just because they're under registering that sensory input. So it's also very common for kiddos within this group to prefer foods with increased sensory input. So a lot of times they will prefer foods with big crunch factor or big flavors. Sometimes they even like more spicy foods, but foods that have more sensory input. Another area that can contribute to picky eating is motor skill challenges. So feeding challenges can occur if a child doesn't have the necessary chewing skills to chew certain foods. So if this is the case, many times children might gag on their food because they don't have those skills to chew their food efficiently, and food can get stuck on their tongue and elicit a gag reflex. A lot of times these kiddos might swallow their food whole because it's just too hard to chew certain foods. A lot of times these kiddos will chew their food and then it's too hard to manage and manipulate, and might even feel scary to then swallow it, so they'll spit their food out. And then a lot of times these kiddos will refuse food groups that are harder to chew foods, like meats is a big one, and then raw vegetables, because those are harder to chew. And then a big kind of red flag, especially for the toddler aged kiddos, is it's common when children have these motor skill challenges, it's pretty common for me to see that they get stuck on purees and pouches, and they have a hard time transitioning to solid table foods because their chewing skills are lacking to some degree. So now the next one, this is a pretty common one also. Some of our kiddos kind of tend to worry a little bit more and the known and don't like change, especially when it comes to food and meal times. And it's also common for kiddos with sensory sensitivities to kind of have more of this worry, anxiousness piece around meal times. So when children learn that sensory input from food can cause sensory overwhelm, or when they learn that chewing is hard and it causes them to gag, they're going to start worrying, and they're going to start feeling a little more anxious around meal times because eating is not pleasant for them. Okay. Also, a lot of times you'll see that these kiddos almost demand their safe foods, because these safe foods, it's what is known, it is what's predictable, and they know exactly what it's going to feel like and taste like and smell like in their mouth. And it's, you know, this rigidity cycle can, and anything that's not on their safe, comfortable food list is a flat no or yuck. So that's kind of that piece. And then temperament. You know, all kiddos have different temperaments, and there's nothing wrong with that. You know, and some kids have more of a natural temperament to where they prefer more control and a little bit less flexibility. And it's not uncommon that when we look at these different causes for picky eating, when I'm doing a feeding assessment, we don't really see red flags of like sensory or motor challenges or medical challenges. And sometimes it's just a child's temperament. And then when that is paired with some, you know, how we talked earlier about practices that might be happening at home that are not optimal to address picky eating, you can kind of see this spiral towards stressful meal times. And then medicals absolutely can impact feeding, and that includes picky eating. So, you know, it's always important to talk to your pediatrician if there are any feeding concerns to help brainstorm and problem solve if there might be a medical component. And we definitely want to address the medical component piece first, because if we don't, that root issue will still be there and that can hinder progress. But some examples of medical conditions that can impact feeding is constipation. That directly impacts appetite. Diarrhea, GI discomfort, reflux is a big one, because if a child eats and then gets reflux and then that's uncomfortable and painful, they're going to start to learn to associate eating with not feeling good. Food allergies, food intolerances, even sometimes enlarged tonsils can impact swallowing. And then some medical conditions that can impact feeding is a harder time protecting their airway with swallowing, resulting in aspiration. So these are all things that you would want to talk to your pediatrician about in this area. Okay, and then I've talked a little bit about this, but the last piece is learned avoidance reactions. So when kiddos are feeling uncomfortable or having pain or feeling worried and afraid with meal times, they're going to start to associate and learn that new foods or certain foods or meal times are not fun and it's not comfortable. So then these learned negative associations can create learned avoidance reactions where kiddos learn to avoid foods. And then we're avoiding foods and we're kind of starting to go down kind of a picky eating cycle. So, and just remember, it's not the kiddos behaving badly. It's just a protective mechanism that children want what's predictable and comfortable and known and what feels safe to them. Okay, so now here's the fun part. So now we're going to kind of go into feeding tips to help with picky and hesitant eating. All right. So I've kind of divided the first tips into some foundational practices. So the first foundational practice is the power of letting go. So we as parents can work on letting go of worry, control, and pressure. And this is hard. And usually when I talk to parents about this first foundational practice, there's usually like two camps. Like one camp that this is a hard recommendation for them because they have such worry and concern that, and they'll say to me, but if I don't ask my child to take a bite at dinner, they're not going to eat. Right? Or if I don't kind of bribe them, you know, eat your broccoli first and then you can have ice cream, they'll never eat a vegetable in their life. So there's kind of that camp, and that's completely understandable. And then there's another camp, he's relieved and validated when I recommend to kind of let go of the worry, control, and pressure, because they've already tried the pressuring and the bribing, and they've learned that it just doesn't work for their child. Um, and some of these things work for some children, okay? But usually what I've seen is if a child falls with what we just talked about, with those different reasons that can contribute to picky eating, like medical issues, sensory, motor, if a child has one of those reasons for picky eating, usually the pressuring or the bribing or trying to take control over what they eat, usually that doesn't work. And it usually leads to battle of the wills and stress around meal times. Okay. So when we take away pressure around meal times, it allows our child's guard to come down. It'll start to lessen anxiety around meal times. And when anxiety goes, appetite goes up. And then our goal is for our children to kind of create this internal motivation to explore new foods, not to do it for us, but this internal motivation to where they're actually enjoying eating and expanding their food range. Okay, so this, I'm just kind of talking about, there's with the worry, control, and pressure, it's kind of this cycle. So typically what I see is, you know, parents tend to get, they're starting to get worried about nutrition, okay, or their child's development, or even their child's health because of poor nutrition. So this leads to parents wanting more control to help their child, right, around meal times. But when this happens, our child's guard goes up, anxiety goes up, and then this kind of spiral of food refusals can occur. So the second foundational practice that I usually try to recommend is recommending for families to kind of change their mindset to being more intentional about creating more peaceful meal times. So, you know, trying to understand why your child's having feeding challenges and having compassion for that, meeting them where they're at with grace and patience, and then taking small steps forward. And that goes to the next bullet point, is having realistic goals, because feeding changes do not typically just happen overnight. It's usually a process, and it's usually small changes over time, where in a couple of weeks you may not see much improvement. You might, but you might not always. But having that more realistic goal that, you know, in a few months from now, or even for some children, you know, in a year from now, being able to look back and saying, wow, we've really come a long way. So just kind of having a better understanding of more realistic goals. And the next bullet points that I have here are just some different feeding models that I kind of base my practice on. There's more that I use and more that I have in my toolbox, but I kind of listed them here. But basically, all three of these feeding approaches kind of just embodies this approach to meet your child where they're at. Have a relationship-based feeding approach, building trust, looking at maybe underlying reasons that might be contributing to feeding challenges and addressing those underlying reasons. So these are just some one. Okay, so foundational practice that I'm going to get into, and this is more of like the actual feeding tips that you can start to do at home, is the power of routine and structure. So these are consistent practices that you can do at home every day, and I have them all listed here, but I'm going to go through each of them and talk about them. So, we talked a little bit about this already, but I wanted to give some tips on how to implement it. So the power of letting go, the first foundational practice. At meal times, focus on family time, not what is eaten. Try to let go of pressure, enjoy each other, and maybe even at meal times, talk to each other, talk about each other's day. The second foundational practice that we already talked about is changing your mindset. So set realistic goals, meet your child where they're at with compassion and grace, and build trust. Foundational practice is what we're getting into right now. So that's the power of routine and structure. So the first place to start is have a feeding chair that supports your child well, especially kiddos who have oral motor challenges. If a child is well supported in their chair, it supports their postural and trunk control. So then they have the stability for more improved fine motor skills of chewing. Okay. A next topic of implementing routine and structure at home is eat at the mealtime table. So try to limit your child, running around or around the house, eating snacks or eating in front of the TV or on the couch. You want to try to come to the mealtime table, because it's just teaching your child that the table is where we sit as a family and meal times occur. And it just can kind of, this consistency and structure can help with meal times. So the next one is eat together as a family whenever possible. This is hard for a lot of families that I work with, just because we are so busy. Our schedules are so all over the place. So nothing has to be perfect. Mindful that eating together with the family is important. And one of the reasons it's so important is the parents and siblings are role modeling. So, maybe your picky eater, cannot tolerate vegetables. Okay. Maybe they're getting used to just looking at the vegetable, not anything with that vegetable, but siblings might be eating that vegetable, or parents might be eating that vegetable. And so everyone at the family is role modeling for that picky or hesitant eater. And role modeling is incredibly powerful. So a huge recommendation is a feeding schedule. A lot of kids graze throughout the day, and that impacts our appetite. So kiddos aren't even hungry when they come to the table. So of course they're not going to be motivated to try a new meat on their plate for dinner. So really just be mindful about a feeding schedule and limiting grazing. Typically, I kind of recommend think about spreading meal times and snacks about 3 hours apart. It's a little less for some kids and a little longer for some, but I think that 3 hours is a good general recommendation for kiddos. And then you don't ever limit water. Your child can have water whenever they want, but be mindful about grazing on juices and snacks in between meal times. The next one is the caregiver chooses what is served at the mealtime. And of course, you can allow your child every once in a while to help you meal plan. But when your child is demanding, I want you to make me, my favorite mac and cheese and chicken nuggets for dinner every single night of the week, it's really important for the caregivers or the parents to kind of take back a little bit of that control to where they start deciding what's served for meal times. But that being said, the next bullet point is there always needs to be at least one preferred food on the plate. That way your child will eat something, right? So that way they'll fill their belly with something, and it keeps their anxiety and worry lower when they come to the table because they're familiar with at least one thing on the plate. So that's incredibly important, is even though you might have some new foods on the plate, always have something that your child feels comfortable with on the plate. Another thing that you can do at home is be mindful about offering a wide variety of nutrition. So offering a protein, grain, fruit, and or vegetable at every meal. This sets the child up for good nutrition because you're offering from each food group, but it also helps to promote consistent exposure to a wide variety of foods. So if your child is refusing vegetables, You don't want to not offer vegetables at all, because they'll never learn about vegetables. So, offering, foods from each of the food groups is important, even if they're refusing foods from a food group. This is hard for a lot of kiddos. So limit distractions during meal times. A lot of the kiddos that I work with have gotten into a pattern where they literally require a screen in order to eat. And it's just a routine that they've gotten into. So if you are in that situation, I usually don't recommend for parents to go cold turkey and remove the screen time. What I usually do with families is we kind of come up with a way to wean screen time slowly over time. But if you're not in that situation, I would recommend being mindful about screen time during meals. I mean, I do it too. I mean, we all have screens during meals on occasion, the TV, or a tablet. But just be mindful of it. Try not to do that whenever you can, because we want our kids to be engaged with us during meals, and we want our kids to be engaged with their food. We want them to start learning what new foods look like and smell like and feel like, and they can't experience or learn about meal times if they're just zoned out watching a screen. Another one is trying to be mindful about ending short order cooking, and what you serve is what you serve. And this stresses a lot of parents out when I make this recommendation. It kind of even stresses me out sometimes, because I find myself, I've definitely done this with my own picky eater, where you make your picky eater what they prefer, and then you make the family, something else. But be mindful that try to make one meal for your whole family. And you can do that because you're also always going to have at least one preferred food as a side for your picky eater. So there's something on the plate that they will eat. And then just try really hard that if you serve your one meal for the family, and your child refuses, don't allow them to go to the pantry and make themselves a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or their favorite meal and bring that back to the table to eat. Try to, say something along the lines of, oh, this is what we made for dinner. You can talk about the preferred food that maybe was on the plate, but it's up to them whether or not they eat. But if they don't eat, they're going to be hungry, and we may not be eating again until the next snack time. So all right, so is repeated exposure to a variety of foods. Okay, so don't give up on foods that are yucked. Accepting foods takes practice, exposure, and exploration. And another really powerful way to get our kids, from eating their favorite foods and making teeny tiny changes to new foods is to do exactly that. So you take their preferred food and you make small changes, and then over time they're eating more and more new foods. So for example, if your child likes crunchy chip-like foods and you put meatloaf on their plate, that's good that you put meatloaf because you're exposing them to new foods, but don't have an expectation that they're just going to gobble down the meatloaf. You want to make small changes. So for example, if your child likes crunchy foods and they're not eating any fruits and vegetables, maybe think about dehydrated fruits and vegetables or fruit and vegetable chips. If your child likes Colby cheese slices, maybe make a small change and think about a Colby cheese stick or Colby cheese shredded cheese. If your child likes strawberry yogurt, maybe try other brands of strawberry yogurt. Or if your child will only eat yogurt through a pouch, maybe try pouring that same pouch into a bowl and eating it with a spoon. That can be hard for some kids. So just making small changes over time. If your child likes crispy bacon, try crispy Canadian bacon or beef jerky. Or if your child likes hot dogs, maybe think of a kolache. So again, just think about small changes to the foods they're already eating. All right, so I'm looking at the time really quick. I'm going to keep going for a little bit, but I definitely know we want to have time to ask questions. Can I have like 5 more minutes? Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. So, so we just talked about the foundational practices to address picky eating. And it's recommended to start with those practices first. Okay. And then I just kind of wanted to quickly talk about nutrition. So a lot of times families will really want to make healthier choices for their families, which is wonderful. But sometimes sometimes healthier choices is a longer term goal. Sometimes kids can't start right into the more healthier choices. We have to start to kind of implement all those strategies that we just talked about. And then once that's in place, then we can start offering more healthy choices. Some ways to add into your child's diet is think about dips and spreads. Dips and spreads can be a wonderful way to add nutrition. Also think about baked goods. So, get in the kitchen with your child and bake with them pancakes, waffles, muffins, brownies, cookies, energy bites, and you can add good nutrition into those foods, like kid-friendly protein powders or healthy oils, or you can puree fruits and vegetables like pureed banana or avocado and put that into the batter of something. Some other ways to add nutrition is, putting butter or oils on their noodles, or, with spreads. If they're going to eat Cheerios or crackers, don't just give them the plain Cheerio or cracker. Put a spread on it. Spread some cream cheese on their Cheerio, or spread some nut butter on their Ritz cracker, or hummus on their Ritz cracker. So think about ways you can add nutrition to foods they're already eating. And smoothies are a great way for added nutrition. So, if your child loves a strawberry banana smoothie, but they want to have nothing to do with vegetables, maybe first your child can put 1 leaf of, spinach into the smoothie, and then they can see, oh, wow, it tastes the same. And then next week, maybe you could put 2 leaves of spinach in, and then you can add more and more over time. Some fun things you can do with smoothies is make popsicles. Pour smoothies into popsicle molds. There's also a lot of fun silicone mold shapes like bears and dinosaurs and hearts and stars, and you can pour nutritious smoothies into these silicone molds and freeze, and then they can eat little tiny nutritious smoothie frozen bears, and that can just bring up the fun factor in eating. Another fun little tip is you can put a smoothie into an ice cube tray, and then pop out the little ice cube and put it in their water or juice, so that they slowly get used to the flavor or the texture of a smoothie over time, because some kids just may not tolerate a smoothie right off the bat. Some other fun things that you can do with food is remember that smaller portions are less overwhelming. So you can get fun little teeny tiny tasting spoons, or fun little teeny tiny Dixie cups for trying new smoothies. Fun plates and utensils can be really great, especially in those toddler years. Getting a tractor fork or a dinosaur spoon or what have you can be really fun for some kids, and it can make meal times more enjoyable. Cookie cutters are fun. You can get a cookie cutter and cut a sandwich, and so it's a fun little shape. Making pictures with food. This is another favorite of mine, is kind of having food bars, so you can have a pizza night or a pasta night, or making yogurt parfaits. Just make taco bar night, and you have all the different sides. And again, they may not eat all the sides you prepare, but they're getting exposed to these new foods. They're learning about it in a fun way. And then another fun thing that can be a good little tip is getting muffin tins or an ice cube tray and just putting all types of different foods in these trays or this tin and just learning about it and exploring food that way. Remember getting in the kitchen and cooking together, baking together, going to the farmer's market together, gardening together, and meal planning and meal prepping with your kids. These are all ways to create positive associations around meal times. So in closing, we talked about the importance of letting go of pressure and control, trying to create enjoyment and peace around meal times, and enjoying each other as a family during meal times. Remember the foundational practices, and that it's just consistent everyday practices that you can do at home. And then once those are in place, you can slowly work towards healthier choices. Make meal times fun, get creative and have fun together, get in the kitchen and bake and cook together, explore new foods through gardening or the farmer's market, and planning meals together. So that's just kind of a little summary of some of the things we talked about. But that is it for me. I thank you so much for having me. I so appreciate and enjoy talking to you guys.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I learned some stuff too, even though I've been working with you
Yay,
last year.
good.
So, yeah, one thing I'll just mention is that you had us play with food deliberately on a cookie sheet, just like put out lettuce and stuff like that, that he just wasn't interested in eating, and just playing around with it as a toy, basically, with his other toys. So that was kind of an interesting way to
yeah,
just get
absolutely.
your hands dirty, so to speak. But I'll turn it over to other people in case they have questions. So I'll put myself back on mute. Thank you.
Appreciate it. I had a question.
Yes.
Thank you, Amy. This has been really helpful. I'm Katie.
Hi, Katie.
Nice to meet you. I have 3 kids, and all of them we're pretty lucky. They're pretty good eaters and they eat most things. But I think where I struggle most is the kids prefer certain things over others. So if you put bread or broccoli on the plate, they'll eat both, but they'll eat their bread first and they'll say, I want more bread. And one of the things that we'll say is, well, you have to eat your broccoli if you want more bread. And what I worry about is that incenting a certain, like, eating more and like not recognizing when you're full, and is that problematic? And do you have any recommendations around strategies to manage through that? Because I think that's where we often get hung up in New York, and I'll stuff all their broccoli in their mouth really quickly in order to get that bread, and then you're like, well, are you really hungry for that, or are you just eating it because you're excited about having a second piece of bread?
Yes.
So do you see that? And if so, how do you recommend dealing with that type of a situation?
Yeah, no, I see that all the time, and that's a very common question that parents have. And so, yes, most kids, if there's, an okay food and a favorite food, they're going to eat the favorite food and want more of the favorite food, right? So a couple things, one, usually I recommend at meal times that it's okay to have seconds, okay? But if you have, in your example, it was broccoli and bread, right? That was your example?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
so with your example, if you have an unlimited stash of bread, they're gonna just keep going to the bread and filling up. So I would just say be mindful of how much you cook. So maybe you give each child 1 piece of bread, okay? And then you have seconds for each, but I maybe wouldn't have thirds back there. And then when they've each had the second piece of bread, you can say, oh, that's all I made for dinner tonight. The bread is all gone. That way there's just not this unlimited seconds, thirds of that favorite food. Now back to the broccoli. It's kind of gray a little bit. So if your child can eat broccoli and is okay with it and enjoys it, is that what I'm hearing?
My kids, they'll eat it. They enjoy it. They just don't, if it's given a choice between bread or broccoli, they're going to eat bread all day. So
yes. So I would first just limit the bread to maybe no more than a second helping. Don't have thirds and fourths, and see if they still notice that their hunger cues, and then they'll just eat their broccoli if they're still hungry. Or honestly, you could even not have seconds of the bread, and see if that helps them eat their broccoli also. But here's the gray piece. So if your child likes to eat broccoli and is not having what we talked about earlier, like motor challenges with broccoli, or is having sensory overwhelm with broccoli, it's okay, and it's great. It's okay to gently say, oh, you have some broccoli on your plate, right? What do you think about, eating that? That's okay. But if your child is really struggling with some extreme picky eating tendencies and motor challenges and sensory overwhelm, I would not say anything about the broccoli. And then if they don't eat the broccoli, then they don't eat the broccoli. At least they're learning about what it looks like. They're learning about, because it's probably smelling, they're learning about what it smells like. Does that make sense? It's kind of 2 recommendations along that range. Of
That does make
eating.
sense. Just one follow-up, because I think the other
Yes.
place we struggle sometimes is with dessert. Like if they know there's ice cream, they'll say they're
Yes.
full, and then they'll eat
Oh,
the ice
yes.
cream, and then they'll say, I want my plate back. So I
Yes.
know they're not full. So are there ways that you could, because dessert, I mean, with broccoli and bread, it's easier to sort of serve them together, but do you just serve your kids dessert first, or how do you sort of handle that piece?
That's a hard one. So in some of the feeding courses I've taken, the recommendation would be to serve dessert with the meal. Okay, but hold on. Okay, so that is a recommendation, and definitely is a very powerful recommendation for some kids. So serving dessert with the meal, and the reason is because we're really trying to get away from dessert is on a pedestal. Like, you have to eat this broccoli first so you can get this dessert, right? And serving dessert with the meal, it levels it out and creates all food as equal. So with some kids, we have to start there, okay? I will say, as a mom, that's very hard for even myself to do. So, when I tell that to families, usually that's not a recommendation that a lot of parents love. So then what I will say is, think of dessert as just another way to enjoy each other. So just trying to keep it separate. So try not to say, eat all your food first and then we can have dessert. Try to enjoy dinner together. And then once that's over, dessert is dessert, and it's just food to enjoy together as a family. And it gets tricky exactly with what you're saying is, children will say they're full because they just want dessert. But I would just try to keep that separate, and maybe not offer dessert every night. So that's not happening every night, saying, oh, I'm full, I don't want my broccoli, I just want ice cream. So maybe if that's happening, keep desserts more to a special occasion. Does that help?
That does help. That helps. I think it's something we struggle with, and we don't do it every night. But when the kids know that it's there, it's like this thing that they just.
I know. I think that's a natural thing. It's tricky.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Good.
Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, well, I think we're getting close to the 11:30 hour, so this is a good time to wrap up. So thank you so much again for speaking. Oh yeah, and LoriAnn, you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say, Amy, would you be adverse if we also post this to our Facebook page, which is we call it Positive Parenting. It's a Facebook page as a group, and if we get questions there, can we just forward those on to you?
Oh, yeah, I would be
sometimes
honored. And yeah, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions that might pop up. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Thanks so much for joining, and thanks so much, Amy, for joining us today.
Oh,
So,
thanks for having me.
have a great rest of your weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.